In the summer of 1969, the fastest, most desirable motorcycles on Earth were British. If you wanted the best, you bought a Triumph, a Norton, or a BSA. 8 out of every 10 big motorcycles sold in America wore a British badge. It was an empire built on chrome, noise, and 100 years of engineering. 6 years later, that empire was building barely 20,000 motorcycles a year. One Japanese company was building 2 million, and the most famous factory in British motorcycling was under siege, chained shut from the inside, occupied by its own workers who refused to let anyone shut it down. This is the story of how the country that gave the world the motorcycle lost it, not in a crash, but in a single decade. And it begins with the most beautiful machine Britain ever made. In 1959, Triumph released the Bonneville. Named after the salt flats in Utah, where British twins had set speed records, it was everything a young man in 1960s Britain or America wanted. A 650 CEC parallel twin, at top speed around 110 miles an hour, long, low and loud, with that unmistakable offbeat exhaust note that no Japanese bike could imitate. The Bonneville wasn't just transport, it was identity. Steve McQueen rode Triumphs. When McQueen's stunt double leapt a Triumph over a fence in The Great Escape, he sold 1 million dreams. British bikes had heritage, style, and a racing record stretching back to the dawn of the sport. For the men who built them in the Midlands, it felt permanent, as if Britain would simply always make the world's best motorcycles. That confidence was about to become the most expensive mistake in the industry's history. To understand how far Britain fell, you have to understand how high it stood. In the 1950s, the BSA Group was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. Triumph, Norton, BSA, Royal Enfield, Vincent, Ariel. The names read like a roll call of everything two-wheeled and fast. Up to 90% of the bikes built in the English Midlands were exported, most of them across the Atlantic, where America had fallen in love with the British twin. But underneath the export figures, something was rotting. The factories were old. Many of the buildings and much of the machinery dated to before the war. The designs were old too. The Bonneville of 1969 was, mechanically, not far removed from the speed twin Edward Turner had designed back in 1937. The bikes still leaked oil. They still had to be kick-started. The British answer to every problem was the same. It had always worked before, so why change? And while the men in Birmingham told themselves that story, 4,000 miles away, a man named Soichiro Honda was building a different one. Honda built its first motorcycle in 1949. To the British, Japanese bikes were a joke, tiny, buzzy little things, cheap copies of Western machines, and that contempt was exactly the door Honda walked through. Honda didn't attack the empire head-on. It came in underneath it. With a brilliant little advertising campaign, you meet the nicest people on a Honda. It sold small, clean, reliable bikes to people who'd never have set foot in a traditional motorcycle dealership. Students, suburbanites. It made motorcycling friendly, and it sold them by the hundreds of thousands. What the British saw as the bottom of the market, Honda saw as the foundation of one. Every nice little Honda put a rider on the ladder. And Honda had something the British factories could only dream of: scale. By pouring the profits from millions of small bikes into research and modern, automated factories, Honda was quietly building the capacity to go after the one thing Britain still owned: the big, fast, expensive motorcycle at the top. In 1969, it pulled the trigger. Soichiro Honda called it his quest to build the king of motorcycles. The result was the CB750, and it didn't just compete with the British twins, it made them obsolete overnight. Where Triumph and BSA offered 2 cylinders, the CB750 had 4, smooth, refined, and willing to rev in a way no British twin ever could. Where the British still fitted a drum brake at the front, the Honda had a hydraulic disc, the first on a mainstream production bike. Where a Bonneville owner stood on a kickstart and prayed, the Honda owner pressed a button and it simply started. Every time. It topped 120 miles an hour, outrunning the British flagships, and it did it without leaking oil onto the garage floor. And here was the killer. It cost about $926. A Triumph Trident or a BSA Rocket 3, the British triples rushed out to answer it, sold for around $836. For roughly $100 more, you got more cylinders, more brakes, more reliability, more of everything. The press called it the first superbike. The buying public called it the obvious choice. The British factories had told themselves for 20 years that nobody could build a better motorcycle. In 1969, somebody did. Here is the part that still stings. Britain didn't lose because its engineers couldn't build a great bike. It lost because the men running the industry had stopped investing in the future years before Honda arrived. While Honda was building automated factories, the British plants were still largely assembling bikes by hand in buildings from another era. While Honda planned model ranges years ahead, the British rushed. The Triumph Trident and BSA Rocket 3, the 3-cylinder bikes, meant to fight the Honda, actually reached the market slightly before the CB750. But they were expensive to build, awkwardly styled, and still wrapped around old thinking. The deeper problem was money, and the lack of it. For 2 decades, profits had been taken out of the companies, rather than plowed back into new designs and new machinery. When the moment came that demanded a huge, fast, expensive response, the cupboard was bare. The empire had been living off its reputation, and reputation couldn't be bolted to a production line. The collapse came quickly, and it came from the top. In 1972, the once mighty BSA, the largest motorcycle maker the world had ever seen, effectively went under, crushed by losses. Ariel was already gone. The British end of Royal Enfield closed its doors the following year. The roll call of great names was becoming a list of the lost. The British government stepped in, terrified of the jobs that would vanish. Its solution was to force the survivors together. In 1973, BSA and Triumph were merged with Norton's parent company into a single consortium, Norton Triumph, under a businessman named Dennis Poor. The idea was to consolidate, cut costs, and save what could be saved. And Poor's plan to save it began with a decision that would detonate the whole thing. To make the numbers work, he announced that the Triumph factory at Meriden, the spiritual home of the Bonneville, would close. The men of Meriden had a different idea. On the 14th of September, 1973, the workers at Meriden did something almost no one expected. They didn't walk out. They walked in, and they stayed. They blockaded the gates. They occupied their own factory. Hundreds of finished Triumphs sat inside, and the workers refused to let a single one leave unless the closure was reversed. It became one of the longest sit-ins in British industrial history. 18 months of men sleeping in shifts at the gates of the plant, they refused to surrender. It was extraordinary, and it was tragic, because while the workers held the line at Meriden, the parent company was starving. It couldn't get the Triumphs it desperately needed to sell, and the occupation drained it of cash it didn't have. In March of 1975, a compromise was reached. The workers would form a cooperative and build Bonnevilles themselves. For a brief, defiant moment, the men who built the Bonneville owned the factory that built it. But a cooperative of proud workers could not outbuild a company making 2 million motorcycles a year. They were fighting the last war with the last weapons, and the world had already moved on. The numbers tell the rest. By the mid-1970s, the entire British motorcycle industry was producing on the order of 20,000 motorcycles a year. In 1975 alone, Honda built 2 million. That isn't a gap, that's an extinction. The Meriden cooperative fought on with astonishing stubbornness, updating the old Bonneville as best it could on almost no money year after year against impossible odds. But every year, the bikes looked a little more like relics, and every year, the Japanese pulled further ahead, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki now piling in alongside Honda. In 1983, the Meriden cooperative finally ran out of road and closed. The gates that the workers had guarded for 18 months shut for good. The Bonneville, the machine that had once defined cool on 2 continents, was, for the moment, gone. The empire that had ruled the world's roads for half a century was over. But this is Britain, and the story doesn't quite end in the rubble. That same year, 1983, a British property developer named John Bloor quietly bought the rights to the Triumph name out of the wreckage. He didn't rush. He spent the better part of a decade and a fortune of his own money building an entirely new, modern factory and a genuinely new range of bikes. The Triumph that exists today, a serious, successful global motorcycle company, is his creation, built on the ashes of the old one. Norton, BSA, and Royal Enfield survived too, though all of them are now owned by Indian companies. So, what actually ended Britain's motorcycle empire? It's tempting to blame one bike, the CB750, or one man, Dennis Poor. But the CB750 only exposed a wound that had been festering for 20 years. The truth is harder. Britain didn't lose because the Japanese got lucky, or because its workers didn't care. The men of Meriden cared enough to live at the gates for a year and a half. Britain lost because the people at the top believed that being the best once meant being the best forever, and stopped building the future while someone else quietly built it for them. The Bonneville built an empire on the idea that nobody could ever do it better. The CB750 was simply proof that someone already had.